Greetings, students, and welcome to this edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies Podcast. Now, in today's edition, we're going to be learning a little bit about the geography of Japan. Now, Japan is a picturesque country with a rugged landscape surrounded by water that supports a population with an ancient and revered culture. But before we begin to talk about the geographic features of Japan, the very first question that we need to ask is, where in the world is Japan? Japan is located off the east coast of Asia, near China and Korea. And Japan itself is a series of islands. Now, there are 4 main islands of Japan, including the island of Kyushu, which we can see in this satellite image here. But there are also thousands of other smaller islands that make up what we know of today as the country of Japan. Now, there's a geographic term that's used to describe this phenomenon, and that is an archipelago. An archipelago means a chain of islands, and that is definitely a term that you need to know when you're studying the geography of Japan. So I tell you what, why don't you pause the video and write that down in your notes, and then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll move on. All right, let's talk about some of these geographic features of Japan. Well, as we said, there are 4 main islands of Japan, and those are Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, and the island of Hokkaido. But if Japan is an archipelago, that means it's also surrounded by some important bodies of water, including the Sea of Japan, to the east the Pacific Ocean, and to the southwest the East China Sea. So what we're saying is that Japan is a series of islands, or an archipelago, meaning that there is a finite amount of space on those islands. And that brings us to the next term which we need to know, which is population density. Population density is the number of people living in a given space. So if you have a relatively small number of people living in, let's say, a square mile, that means that there's relatively low competition for the resources available there. That's what we would describe as a low population density. But as the population starts to rise in that same amount of space, you have more and more competition for those resources. And you can get to what's known as a high population density. Well, let's look at Japan. Japan has a population of over 127 million people. That's about 40% of the population of the United States and ranks it 10th on the list of countries in the world in terms of population. Now, that also, though, tells us that Japan crams this very large population of people into a space only about the size of the state of Montana. So, does that mean that Japan has a low population density or a high population density? That's right, they have a very high population density. And adding to that is the fact that the landscape of Japan plays a role in where people live in that country. Much of Japan is made up of rugged mountains, which aren't very good for building towns and villages and cities, but also aren't very good for farming and producing food. Let's take a look at a topographical map of Japan. We're going to zoom in, and you'll see that about 70% of Japan is rugged landscape with a relatively high elevation, which means that much of the population of Japan is going to be crammed into even smaller spaces, mostly located along the coast. But there's another way that the Japanese people have to contend with the physical features on Japan. Let's go back to that satellite image we looked at earlier. On the satellite image, you can actually see a plume of ash rising from an active volcano. 10% of the world's active volcanoes are located in Japan. That's because Japan is on what's known as the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is a fault line located around the tectonic plate that forms much of the Pacific Ocean. So that means that Japan is subject to a great deal of seismic activity. That includes not just volcanoes, but also earthquakes, as well as tsunamis, which often result from earthquakes, including the devastating tsunami that hit Japan in 2011. So then let's step back and consider what we've said so far about the geography of Japan. We know that Japan is an archipelago, meaning that it is a series of islands. But we also know that Japan has a high population density, meaning that there are a lot of people crammed into those relatively small islands. And compounding that is the fact that Japan is very mountainous. It has a high average elevation, and there's also a great deal of seismic activity. So what that means is Japan is a landscape where people and nature live in a very delicate balance. Well, that's it for today's podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it, and keep studying the social studies.